My name is Marcus. I spent 6 months working the graveyard shift at the regional botanical gardens. I took the job because I thought it would be easy. During the day, the place is beautiful. Families walk around, kids point at the flowers, and the sun makes everything look safe. But when the sun goes down and the staff members leave, the energy shifts. The gardens are huge, but most of my shift was spent inside the Great Glass House. It is a massive structure made of steel and glass panes. At midnight, the silence inside that glass house is not peaceful, it is oppressive. You can hear the climate control system, but it feels like it is struggling against the darkness. The humidity is set high to keep the tropical plants alive. It stays around 80%. When you walk in from the cool night air, the moisture hits you like a wet blanket. It feels like the air is breathing. It is thick and smells like rotting wood and damp soil. I had to carry a flashlight and walk the gravel paths every 2 hours. My boots made a crunching sound that felt too loud. The plants are organized into displays. Some are massive palms that reach the top of the dome. Others are small, weird shrubs from parts of the world I have never seen. In the dark, their shapes change. A tall fern looks like a person standing perfectly still at the edge of your light. I found myself snapping my head around. I would point my light at a corner because I thought a branch moved, but it was always just a plant. The problem was the feeling of being watched. It was constant. It felt like the static displays were not actually static. I would walk past a group of vines, and my brain would tell me they were in a different position than they were 10 minutes ago. I blamed the shadows. Light does weird things when it hits glass and leaves at sharp angles, but the feeling did not go away. It was a deep discomfort. You are alone in a glass cage, surrounded by things that are alive but do not move. They shouldn't move. The stillness was too perfect. I kept my eyes on my watch, counting down the minutes until my next round. I just wanted to get back to the security office to look at the monitors. The security office felt safer than the paths. The transition from the bright daytime tourists to this heavy silence was jarring every night. You realize very quickly that plants are living things that take up space and breathe. I felt like an intruder in their world. It was their space now. I stood by the door, taking one last look at the dark canopy. The palms looked like skeletal fingers stretching upward toward the glass ceiling. I stepped out, locking the door behind me, but I could still feel their presence through the glass. The second week of the night shift brought the first sound I could not explain. I was sitting in a small chair near the fern gully. It was about 2:30 in the morning. I heard a sharp tap. It came from the glass panes at the very top of the dome. That part of the roof is nearly 60 feet in the air. There are no trees outside tall enough to reach it, and the wind was dead calm that night. Tap, tap, tap. It was a rhythmic sound, like a knuckle hitting a window to get someone's attention. I stood up and shined my light toward the ceiling. The beam barely reached that far, but I saw nothing but black glass and steel beams. I decided to continue my patrol. I walked into the fern gully, which is the dampest part of the gardens. The ferns are thick and grow over the edges of the gravel paths. As I walked, I noticed something that made me feel sick. Every time I took a step, I heard a second step right after mine. It was a wet, heavy sound, like a large foot hitting mud. I stopped moving. The sound stopped a half-second later. I took 3 fast steps. 3 fast, wet thuds followed me from somewhere deep in the undergrowth. It was perfectly mimicking my pace. I turned around and swept my flashlight across the ferns. The leaves were still. There was no one there, but the smell of damp earth was suddenly much stronger. It felt like someone was standing 3 feet away, but the light showed me nothing but green leaves. My own breathing sounded too loud in the humid air. I moved toward the restricted research zone. This area is fenced off because the plants there are extremely rare. No staff members were scheduled to work that night, and the gate was locked with a heavy chain. I shined my light over the fence. Several large specimens were completely crushed. They hadn't just been stepped on, they looked like they had been trampled by something very heavy. Large branches were snapped, and the dirt was kicked up everywhere. There were no boot prints in the mud, just deep, messy indentations. I checked the gate again. The chain was still tight. No human could have gotten inside without cutting that fence. I stood there in the dark, listening. The tapping on the glass high above started again, but this time it was faster. It sounded like it was following me from the roof as I moved. I didn't want to stay in the gully. I walked back toward the main exit. Every step I took was still being echoed by that wet, heavy thud in the bushes. I reached the door and stepped out, the sound of the tapping still echoing in my ears. I felt like I had barely escaped something that was learning how I moved. I sat in the security office. About a month into the job, the lighting system failed. The Great Glass House has motion sensors that turn on bright orange lights whenever a guard walks through. On a Tuesday night at 3 in the morning, I stepped onto the main gravel path and nothing happened. I waved my arms around, but the sensors didn't click. The whole place was pitch black, except for the pale moonlight coming through the glass roof. The moon was full, so everything had a silver, ghostly look to it. I turned on my flashlight, but the beam felt weak against the massive darkness of the palms. I started walking toward the tropical section. The humidity was still thick, and the air was 80 degrees. I could feel sweat on my neck. As I rounded a corner near the giant traveler's palms, I saw something move. It wasn't a swaying branch. It was a dark, solid shape weaving between the thick vines. It was about 7 feet tall and very thin. Its limbs looked too long, and it moved with a strange, jerky motion that didn't look like a person at all. It ducked behind a massive tree trunk before I could get a good look at its face. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart was pounding against my ribs. I kept my light fixed on that tree trunk, but nothing came out. Then, the air changed. Usually, the glass house is a wall of heat, but suddenly, a wave of intense cold hit me. It wasn't just a draft. It felt like someone had opened a giant industrial freezer right in front of me. I could see my own breath in the silver moonlight. The temperature must have dropped 40 degrees in a matter of seconds. My skin turned to goosebumps and my teeth actually started to chatter. In an 80-degree room, this was physically impossible. I looked at the thermometer mounted on a nearby post. The red needle was dropping fast. I heard a low, raspy sound coming from the canopy above me. It sounded like something was dragging a heavy, wet rope over the metal rafters. I pointed my light upward. I caught a glimpse of a pale gray limb retracting into the dark leaves of a palm tree. It didn't have fur or clothes. It looked like slick, wet skin. The cold was so sharp now that my hands were shaking. I realized that the motion sensors hadn't failed because of a technical glitch. They had been bypassed by something that knew exactly how to stay in the shadows. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my light on the ceiling and the floor at the same time. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of something heavy shifting its weight directly over my head. I needed to get to the exit, but the cold was making it hard to move my legs. I felt like a deer being watched by a hungry wild hunter. I went back to the glass house the next night with a heavy-duty spotlight. I wanted to find out what was making that tapping sound on the glass. I walked over to the section of panes near the fern gully. I noticed something strange on the glass frames. It was a thick, gray residue. It looked like a wide slug trail, maybe 4 inches across, but it was much thicker. It wasn't just on the outside of the building. Some of it was smeared on the inside edge of the metal frame. It was a viscous substance that shimmered under my light. I touched a bit of it with my gloved hand. It was sticky and very cold, like half-frozen grease. It had a faint smell of copper, like old blood. I looked up at the rafters again. The movement I had seen the night before wasn't caused by the ventilation system. I watched a large, thick palm frond bend nearly in half. There was no wind inside the building at all. The air was completely still. I realized then that something was crawling through the upper canopy. It was moving with a purpose. It wasn't just climbing, it was navigating the steel beams like they were a ladder. It was using the height to stay out of my light and watch me from above. This wasn't an animal that had accidentally gotten trapped inside. This was a predator that knew the layout of the rafters perfectly. It was hunting from the ceiling down toward the floor. As I stood under the tall traveler's palm, the smell in the room changed completely. The great glass house usually smells like a flower shop. It's a mix of sweet jasmine and damp, clean earth. But suddenly, a wave of stench hit me. It was the smell of old, wet earth mixed with something sweet and rotten. It smelled like a dead animal that had been left in a swamp for a week. It was so powerful that it made my eyes sting. It totally overpowered the scent of the orchids. The smell felt like it was coming from right behind my neck. I was too afraid to turn my head. My heart was hitting my chest so hard it hurt. I heard a soft, wet sliding sound on the gravel path behind me. It was very close, maybe 3 or 4 feet away. The air around my body felt heavy and tight. I didn't see a shadow this time, but I felt the air move like something large had just stepped into the space behind me. The smell of wet dirt and decay was so thick I could almost taste it on my tongue. I knew if I stayed there for another second, I would not be able to move at all. I kept my eyes on the gravel path and started to walk. I didn't run yet, but my legs felt heavy. The sliding sound followed me. I did not look back. I knew that if I turned around and saw what was making that sliding sound, I would probably just stop and give up. I started walking faster. My boots were hitting the gravel path with loud, messy crunches. The sound behind me didn't just stay close, it started to get faster too. The sliding noise turned into a heavy, wet pounding. It sounded like a large animal was running on 2 legs, but the weight of it was much more than a human. I heard a massive palm frond snap and hit the floor with a loud bang. Something was shoving its way through the thick canopy right behind me. I broke into a full sprint. I didn't care about the rare plants or the gravel anymore. I just wanted to get to the steel exit door at the end of the main hallway. The air behind me felt like a physical weight, pushing me forward. I could hear the wet, heavy breathing of whatever was chasing me. It was a raspy, gurgling sound that felt like it was right at my shoulder. I reached the heavy steel door and grabbed my keyring. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the keys twice. I heard a loud screech of metal against metal from the rafters above the door. I finally found the right key and shoved it into the lock. I turned it, threw the door open, and slammed it shut behind me. I leaned my whole body weight against the cold steel and locked the deadbolt. I heard a dull, heavy thud hit the other side of the door, followed by a long, slow scratching sound. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my car in the parking lot until the sun came up. At 7 in the morning, the day shift supervisor, a guy named Bill, arrived to open the main gates. I walked over to him and asked him to come look at the exit door with me. We went to the back of the glass house. The morning light was bright and clear. When we got to the steel door, Bill stopped walking. There were 4 deep, jagged gouges carved directly into the heavy metal of the door. They were about 6 inches long and 1 inch deep. No human tool could have made those marks that quickly. The metal was curled back at the edges of the cuts. Bill didn't say a word. He just stared at the door for a long time. I went into the office and wrote my resignation letter right then. I realized that the city wasn't spending all that money on climate control and rare soil just to preserve exotic plants. The plants were just the camouflage. The humidity and the darkness were for something else entirely. They were keeping an environment for something much older that lived in those rafters. I don't know what they were feeding. I work as a data technician at a remote research outpost called Station 4, located in the high Arctic Circle. Today is April 3rd, 2026. My nearest neighbor is a weather station 300 miles to the east across an ice shelf. Outside, a brutal blizzard is hitting the facility. The wind is sustained at 80 miles per hour, and the temperature has dropped to 60 degrees below zero. Inside the station, the air is dry and smells like recycled oxygen and old coffee. My job is simple, but lonely. I monitor a network of 20 automated wildlife cameras. These cameras are designed to track polar bear populations and caribou migration patterns. Most of the time, I am just staring at empty snow or the blurry tail of a fox. The monitoring system is highly advanced. It uses motion sensors that send a sharp, high-frequency ping to my headset whenever something larger than a rabbit enters the frame. The software is supposed to ignore the movement of blowing snow or shifting ice. At exactly 2:14 a.m., a loud, steady ping echoed in my ears. I sat up in my chair and pulled the feed for camera 4 onto the main screen. This camera is mounted on a reinforced steel pole 50 yards from the station's primary airlock. The visibility was terrible. The screen was mostly white static and gray shadows from the blowing snow. I adjusted the brightness and contrast settings to cut through the haze. I expected to see a polar bear scavenging for scraps or huddling against the wind. Instead, I saw a silhouette that made my stomach turn. It was a bipedal figure, standing upright on 2 legs. It was far too tall to be a human, and it certainly wasn't one of the other 3 researchers currently sleeping in the bunks below. The figure was standing just beyond the reach of the station's exterior floodlights. It was a dark, distorted shape against the chaotic white background of the storm. It was pacing. It moved back and forth in a tight 20-foot line, right on the edge of the light perimeter. The way it moved was wrong. It didn't struggle against the gale force winds. It moved with a smooth, rhythmic gait that seemed completely unaffected by the sub-zero environment. I leaned closer to the monitor, trying to see any detail of its face or clothing. There was nothing but a void. Every few seconds, the figure would stop its pacing and turn its body toward the camera. It felt like it was looking directly at the lens, even though the camera is hidden in a protective housing. I checked the system logs to see if the sensor was malfunctioning. The data showed a solid mass of approximately 300 pounds moving at a steady pace. The thing was real. It was right outside the door, and it was waiting for me. I spent the next 20 minutes trying to convince myself that the silhouette on camera 4 was just a trick of the light in the blowing snow. I decided to switch the display over to the thermal imaging software. The system is designed to track polar bear populations by identifying their heat signatures against the sub-zero landscape. On a normal night, the thermal feed is mostly a deep, dark blue. A living creature like a bear shows up as a dull orange or yellow shape. You can usually see their hot spots, like their eyes, their nose, or the pads of their feet, where the heat escapes their thick fur. I clicked the icon for the FLIR camera mounted next to the optical lens. The screen flickered for a second as the sensors calibrated to the -60-degree environment. What I saw on the screen made no sense at all. The figure was not orange or yellow, it was a bright, glowing white. In thermal imaging, white indicates an intense level of heat. It was like a literal furnace was standing in the middle of a blizzard. The temperature readout on the side of the screen started climbing rapidly. The software flagged a localized heat spike of over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. This was physically impossible for any biological organism living in the Arctic. I compared the shape to the known biological profiles in our database. A polar bear has a very specific musculoskeletal heat map. You can see the heat moving through their heavy shoulders and legs as they walk. A human in a thermal suit looks like a series of connected heat pockets, but this entity was a solid, uniform pillar of white energy. There were no cooler areas where limbs joined the torso. There were no visible internal organs or a heart beating. It was just a tall, thin shape of pure, concentrated heat. The lack of a traditional musculoskeletal structure was deeply disturbing. It moved its long, spindly arms, but the thermal signature did not shift or change intensity. It was as if the heat was not coming from a metabolic process, but was the actual substance of the thing itself. I checked the exterior ambient sensors. The air temperature was still dropping, yet this thing was standing there, radiating heat that should have been melting the permafrost 10 feet deep. I pulled up the technical logs to check for a sensor calibration error. I ran a diagnostic on the lens housing to see if the heating element had shorted out and caused a false reading. The system returned to green status. Everything was working perfectly. The data was accurate. There was something standing 50 yards away from my station that was hotter than a running car engine, but it was shaped like a starving man. I felt a cold knot of dread tighten in my chest as I watched the white shape move closer to the perimeter line. It was really real. I could not just sit there and watch a white ghost on a screen all night. I had to see if the equipment was lying to me. I stood up and walked to the gear locker. I pulled on my heavy down-filled parka and my thick insulated bibs. I laced up my Sub-Zero boots and grabbed a high-definition handheld camera. I didn't tell the others. They were exhausted from the supply run, and I didn't want to sound crazy over a thermal glitch. I stepped into the airlock. The heavy steel door hissed as the pressure equalized. When the outer door opened, the wind hit me like a physical punch. It was a wall of white noise and ice crystals. I kept my back to the station wall and moved toward the area near camera 4. The snow was deep, reaching my knees in some spots. I held the handheld camera out in front of me, recording everything in 4K resolution. I reached the exact spot where the monitor showed the figure pacing back and forth. I pointed the camera down at the ground. I expected to see deep ruts in the snow. A 300-pound animal pacing for 20 minutes should have left a clear trail. The wind was strong, but it wasn't enough to fill in deep tracks that quickly. The snow was perfectly flat. It was pristine, untouched powder. There was not a single footprint. There were no heavy indentations from a heel or a toe. I moved the camera around in a wide circle. I checked for any sign of weight displacement. Nothing. Then I remembered the heat signature. If that thing was really 200 degrees, the snow should have been melting or turning into steam the moment it touched it. I knelt down and touched the surface of the snow with my gloved hand. It was freezing and dry. There was no ice crust. There were no small melt holes. I stood there in the middle of the blizzard, feeling a heavy sense of confusion. I looked up at camera 4, mounted on its steel pole above me. I knew the lens was pointed right at me. I knew the sensor was active. I checked the small monitor on my handheld camera. The footage was clear. I was standing in the middle of a blank white page. It was like the entity I saw on the screen didn't actually exist in the physical world. But the station logs don't lie. The sensors had felt the weight. The thermal lens had seen the heat. I felt very exposed out there. The station lights only went so far, and the darkness beyond was absolute. I realized that if this predator could walk on snow without leaving a trace, it could be standing 5 feet away from me right now, and I would never know it until it touched me. I turned around and started walking back to the airlock as fast as I could. I got back inside the station and slammed the airlock shut. I was breathing hard, and my face was stinging from the cold. I didn't even take off my parka before I sat back down at the monitor. I looked at camera 4. The screen was empty. The white-hot figure was gone. I started checking the other camera feeds. One by one, the status lights on my control panel began to flicker from green to red. Camera 7 went dark first, then camera 9. These cameras are mounted on heavy steel poles bolted deep into the permafrost. They don't just fail because of a storm. I pulled up the last few seconds of footage from camera 7. I saw a long, thin shadow move across the lens. It didn't break the glass. It didn't smash the housing. It looked like the power cable had been neatly unplugged or severed at the base. This thing wasn't just wandering around in the dark anymore. It was systematically disabling my eyes. It was creating a blind spot in the station's perimeter. It knew exactly where the sensors were located. This required a level of intelligence that no polar bear or Arctic wolf possesses. It was calculated. It was trying to make sure I couldn't see where it was coming from next. I turned up the volume on the exterior microphones. I heard the roar of the wind, but underneath that noise, there was something else. It was a rhythmic, metallic scratching sound. It was coming from the external hull of the research station itself. Scratch, 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 scratch. It sounded like a fingernail dragging across a chalkboard, but much heavier. I realized the rhythm was not random. It was a pattern. It was 3 slow scratches followed by 2 fast ones. It repeated every 10 seconds. It sounded like it was trying to mimic the cadence of a human voice or a greeting. It was testing the resonance of the steel walls. I felt a cold realization sink in. This entity was not looking for food. If it wanted to eat us, it would have tried to smash through the airlock or the reinforced windows long ago. It was showing signs of a very deep sentient curiosity. It was studying the station. It was learning how we lived inside this metal box. It was trying to figure out how to get to us without breaking its toys. I looked at the remaining camera feeds. Only the primary entrance camera was still online. The scratching on the hull moved closer to the airlock. It was moving around the station like a person inspecting a new house. I realized we weren't just researchers anymore. We were specimens in a jar, and whatever was outside was finally ready to open the lid. I reached for the intercom to wake up the rest of the crew. We needed to prepare for a breach, but I knew the steel walls would not hold. I hit the alarm and woke up the rest of the crew. Sarah and Miller ran into the comms room, rubbing their eyes and looking confused. I didn't say a word. I just pointed at the last working monitor. The figure was standing directly in front of the primary airlock door. This was the clearest view we had ever had. It was about 8 feet tall. It didn't have any clothes or fur. Its skin was a pale, flat gray, and it looked as smooth as a river stone. It had no nose and no ears. Its eyes were just 2 dark, shallow indentations in its skull. It wasn't breathing. There was no steam coming from its face in the -60-degree air. Miller reached for the radio to call the bush pilot, but the static was absolute. The entity reached out a long, thin arm and touched the external power array housing. The monitor flared with a bright white spark, and then the screen went black. A second later, the overhead lights flickered and died. The hum of the ventilation system stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and terrifying. The station shifted to emergency battery power. A dim red light bathed the room, casting long, jerky shadows against the metal walls. We were now on blackout protocol. We had to turn off everything to preserve the heat and oxygen for as long as possible. We sat there in the red dark, huddled together near the center of the room. The heaters were dead. I could feel the sharp cold starting to seep through the insulated floor. We didn't talk. We just listened. The scratching on the hull had finally stopped. That was much worse than the noise itself. We knew it was standing right on the other side of that 4-inch thick steel airlock door. There is no way to lock the outer wheel from the inside. It's a safety feature designed for emergency rescue access from the outside. If that thing understood how a handle worked, it could just walk right in. I'm writing this in my official logbook by the light of a small pen light. The temperature inside the station has already dropped to 10 degrees. My breath is coming out in thick white clouds. Sarah is crying quietly into her sleeves, but Miller is just staring at the airlock with wide, empty eyes. We heard a soft metallic clink a few minutes ago. It sounded like the heavy outer handle being lifted very slowly. It didn't turn yet. It was just a test of the mechanism. Whatever is out there is waiting for the metal to get brittle enough from the deep cold to snap. Or maybe it is just waiting for us to freeze until we can't fight back anymore. There are no more pings, no more cameras. The sound of the Arctic wind howling outside. We are trapped in this cold dark. My name is Caleb.